America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, communications director at JCN.
Jordan, thanks so much for sitting in today. All of you can also subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. So, Jordan, I am really happy to see that the House introduced legislation, the House version of the Prove It Act. It came out of Representative Finstad and Caravio, I believe I'm pronouncing his name correct, introduced legislation. And the Prove It Act was originally last year introduced by Senator Joni Ernst in the Senate. And it really stemmed from conversations that Alfredo had with the Small Business Committee, who Senator Ernst is the ranking member, about our American Small Business Prosperity Plan. And she really connected with the whole regulation aspect of it. The element of that plan that was going to focus on exempting small businesses from new regulations that disproportionately hurt them, and essentially make business, government agencies and legislators prove that there wouldn't be a disproportionate impact on small businesses. So I'm really happy to see this legislation come out of the House. Because that means that, legislators are really understanding what kind of impact these regulations have and how the rules are already there, really. I mean, this just forces their agencies to do their job.
Yeah, it is really exciting development for small businesses, having the Prove It Act introduced in the House as well. It holds accountable government regulators to do the right thing and follow the laws to make sure the small businesses aren't disproportionately impacted by these rules. And the cool thing is that if they don't do that, if they don't follow the books to make sure that small businesses aren't directly or indirectly impacted, then small businesses will be exempt from the regulations, which when you consider the disproportionate impact that regulations have on small businesses, it's a really, really exciting development.
Yeah. And for people who kind of don't, we all understand what a tax is. You get the bill, it says, hi, I'm a tax. It's a sales tax, a labor tax, a federal tax, a state tax, whatever kind of tax it is, inventory tax. Regulations come in the form of costs, compliance, time. They take valuable time away from employers. They are additional costs at complying with rules. And all of that comes at a cost. And the time that a small business owner spends complying is costly too, right? Because they're not running their business, they're not growing their business, and producing whatever their company produces to keep the economy going, just to help people kind of understand what a regulation can look and feel like.
I think that's the best way to describe it, is a tax. I mean, I think a regulation is a tax. And when you think of the impact it has on small businesses that don't have a compliance department, I mean, a big business has a department that they staff completely, just their whole job is to analyze and comply with these regulations. A lot of small businesses don't even have HR departments.
Right.
So all the regulation compliance costs is borne by the owners and managers of the company, of the small business. And that's taking away valuable time that they could be spending on their product or services, bettering it. And it's just a complete deadweight loss. I mean, one way to think about it, and Alfredo wrote about this in his book published last year, The Real Race Revolutionaries, is just like, consider who is more impacted by some of these ridiculous labor and environmental regulations. The neighborhood dry cleaner the neighborhood restaurant, the neighborhood taco stand, or the downtown law firm that is helping, that wants to virtue signal and push for these regulations. I mean, it's obvious which one is going to be more impacted by it. The same thing with the whole laptop class of people who are now just making their money working from home on laptops. I mean, they are not affected by regulations the same way the neighborhood restaurant is, or some of these neighborhood establishments that have to, for the energy angle, spend tens of thousands of dollars to keep their lights on and keep their manufacturing going. So I think when you think of it this way, you really realize the impact of small business that regulations have on small businesses.
That's a great example with like restaurants. I know that there's been a big attack on some of these pizza restaurants or Italian restaurants that have the big brick oven pizzas because of the environmental side, wanting to force those, at least in New York, wanting to force those restaurant owners to go back and retrofit their brick ovens. And I don't know about you, but I know New Yorkers are very, very picky about their pizza. And so to change those recipes and how they're cooked is going to be very devastating for New Yorkers. But it is that worktop class at home that's like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't affect me, not in my backyard, right? That's the...
Exactly. Yeah. Just imagine the last time you've had microwave pizza versus a good oven pizza, and the difference is pretty night and day. But I think with the regulation front, it's really these, in my view, it's the two buckets: the environmental regulations, all this net zero stuff that is pushing that you can't even have natural gas, pushing up energy costs. And then on the other side, which we'll get into later with our guests, are the labor regulations. These regulations that make it so costly to hire an employee, especially entry level or starter employee. So that's what's really exciting about the Prove It Act. And just getting back to one thing you mentioned off the top, that another part of it that's exciting is the fact that it is truly bipartisan. It's co-sponsored by a Republican and a Democrat. And this just gets back to a lot of what we always say. Small business really is the last bipartisan constituency that Republicans and Democrats both support. So the fact that it has this support from both major parties is very leaves us optimistic for passage in this divided Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, finally, just to bring it back around, it is part of this is one element of our American Small Business Prosperity Plan, which is an 8-point plan that was focused on providing a policy blueprint to Congress on how to bring small businesses back from the pandemic. Things like making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, dealing with regulations, like in this legislation, increasing domestic energy production here at home and bringing us back to being energy independent. Opening up new areas for capital for small businesses, policy issues like that will really help small businesses. So I'm really proud of our work and how we've driven all of these issues and brought them front and center to members on the Hill so that they can hear what small businesses need.
Yeah, but thanks to our work, we helped facilitate 10,000 small business letters on the Senate version of the bill, the Ernst bill that you mentioned earlier, in support, showcasing just how important regulatory relief is for average small businesses out there. And again, it's something that you're not going to see on the front page of the newspaper or in this busy news cycle, but it's the issues that are actually affecting Main Street and actually affecting communities across the country, trying to fight back against this federal overreach. And I think the Prove It Act is a great first step anyway of allowing small business owners an opportunity to get out from it.
And we're joined by Mike Watson. Mike is the Research Director of Capital Research Center and serves as the Managing Editor for Influence Watch. Today, we'll be talking to Mike about the administration's labor policies and how they align strongly with the labor unions that brought the administration to power. Mike, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to Mike today because Mike and I actually worked together about a decade ago.
Long
I was
ago.
lucky enough to be trained by Mike. And I think he's probably one of the top smartest person on labor policy in the country. So a real honor to have you on today, Mike.
I appreciate the compliment.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Mike, and Capital Research Center.
Well, so at Capital Research Center, we study the organizational influence, focusing on the left, but a little, we we look at how the right is organized as well. And in that capacity, I kind of do two things. One, I manage our influencewatch.org website, which has extensive backgrounders on all sorts of organizations and people that are involved in the public policy process. And then I also do most of our study of labor unions and the labor union, the organizational backers of organized labor.
Mike, can you give us a bit of an overview of the role of labor unions in American politics today?
Yeah, so we can take this back. I tend to look at this all historically. So, if you take it back to the 70s and even before that, it was reasonable to assume that, a working man was probably going to be a union member, potentially involved in his union. At the peak in the 1950s, about 1 in 3 wage earners was a union member. Today, that has declined. I think it's 6% in the private sector, slightly over 10% if you include government workers. And that government workers point is important. Over the past 30 or 40 years, the composition of organized labor has gone from factory workers, construction workers who are in a collective bargaining setup, more towards government workers and also people who work in what I like to call parastatal professions, nonprofits, advocacy groups, and then government contractors, businesses that rely for their revenue on big government. And what that has caused is it has moved, organized labor was always left-leaning, and especially economically left-leaning. They always wanted a higher minimum wage. They always wanted it to be easier to organize a union. They always wanted more regulations. But now the constraints that, if you were in a, let's say, the auto workers are always a bad one because they've always been really left-wing. But if you were working in a factory, you relied on the factory to continue operating, to make money and continue operating. Today, almost half of union members are paid by tax money, and they don't have that constraint, and they can be essentially as radical as they want.
Wow. And can you then, piggybacking off of that, can you also explain the role that unions have in funding the Democrat Party and the activist agenda? Yeah.
So while they're probably not quite the forces in the post-Citizens United era where we've got the Tom Steyers and people with Reid Hoffmans and people with their own sort of private political machines, organized labor is still throwing tens of millions of dollars every election cycle into the Democratic Party. And more importantly, I would say they're throwing tens of millions of dollars every year into the broader progressive movement. So into groups like the Center for Popular Democracy, which is a sort of left-wing organizing and policy group, groups like Economic Policy Institute, which is sort of the sidecar think tank to organized labor, groups like National Employment Law Project, which advocates for labor union-aligned economic policy. And, a lot of this, especially on the infrastructure building side, is coming out of dues money. It's not coming out of elective funds where the union member has decided, yes, I want to support affirmatively my union's political and policy agenda. No, this is coming out of the money that they pay in order to have a voice in their workplace.
When you think about the union dues and what they're supporting, I come out of the automotive industry. In my past life, I worked for Chrysler at their headquarters in Michigan. And after having watched the auto strikes last year and seeing a president for the first time actually join a picket line, when you watch some of the interviews with the rank and file folks on the picket line, they seem to know the deal. They seem to know that the administration didn't have their long-term interests with regard to the environmental regulations that they're imposing on the auto industry. Yes, they want to make more money and all of that, but a lot of them seemed to really understand what was happening with the move towards EVs.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've taken to calling this everything leftism, where institutional progressive organizations, of which labor unions are one, and they have the related concept of social justice unionism, they feel compelled or are driven by their activist cadres to walk in lockstep with the other members of the coalition. Now, you mentioned the auto workers, the UAW, and the environmentalists. And, that's an interesting one because it is, again, fairly certain that the increasing environmentalist regulations on the automobile industry will reduce employment in it. UAW is still pushing the just transition in those words, those very committed left-wing words. Why? Well, part of it may be that they're just expecting coalitional payoffs. We saw in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a provision, I don't know if it ever made it into law, that would have restricted some of the subsidies for electric vehicles, specifically to American union-made electric vehicles. And if you look at, on the environmentalist side, the Sunrise Movement, which is one of the more radical environmentalist groups, one of their everything leftist positions is union jobs for all. So some of it is just coalitional horse trading. But I think some of it is this ideological belief that as a good trade unionist, you're supposed to align, if you're a union leader more so than the rank and file, you're supposed to be a down-the-line progressive, and you're supposed to support whatever the progressive agenda of the day is. This is why you have the UAW endorsing a ceasefire in Israel-Palestine, even though that seems to have no bearing on working conditions at factories in Flint. And I try to use it to illustrate, like, this is just how the unions operate. And I'm studying it now, for a future piece, but it's interesting how it developed historically because it's been around for a while.
Mike, can you explain how this tension between what the labor union bosses are pushing, this broad-based progressivism, is manifesting itself with the rank and file members? Are we seeing any attrition from, say, Democrats supporting union members moving over to Republicans?
Hard to say. The sort of best worst evidence that we have are public opinion polls, specifically exit polls in elections. And they show pretty consistently for a while that between 35 and 40% of union households, which is the, if you're a union member or anyone in your immediate family is a union member, are voting Republican and again, this has been this way since at least the 2010s. Now, here come all the caveats. One, it's exit polls, which are, any political scientist will tell you, are not the most reliable sources of public opinion data. Two, a union household could be a factory worker. It could be a miner. It could be a public school teacher. I think the latest data that unionstats.com compiles, they it's a couple of economists, they analyze this data. Slightly less than half of union members today are government workers. School teachers, sanitation workers, DMV clerks, federal civil servants. So their voting habits are going to be informed by more than just the fact that they're labor union members. They don't break it out. The public opinion polls don't break it out public-private sector, partly because there are so few private sector union members these days. So I think the more notable consequence for union political intervention is that their recruitment has not been great over the, in 1996, John Sweeney, who was a card carrying, who was reported widely at the time to be a card carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America when he took over the AFL-CIO, came in. We're going to do organizing. We're going to organize the unorganized. Did not broadly succeed. Union density in the private sector continued to fall. Andy Stern, his successor at the SCIU, frequent visitor to the Barack Obama White House during Obama's first term. He splits off from the AFL-CIO because we're going to do even more organizing and organize even more of the unorganized. Didn't really succeed. I think that a not insubstantial amount of just what I call the long decline in union density, the proportion of workers who are union members, is a consequence of workers who are either not terribly politically involved or openly conservative saying, we don't want anything to do with these organizations.
Got it. And you've written a lot about the mutual backscratching between Democratic administration and unions. Obviously, Democrats are wanting greater unionization to have more dues money come to them through contributions and fund their progressive allies. And then unions are hoping for rules to relax and increase unionization. Do you mind just talking a little bit about that dynamic?
Yeah. So I guess I'll use the sort of the most recent one. They announced the Obama administration, the Biden administration announced that they were going to reclassify who could be classified as an independent contractor, somebody in business for themselves. And if you're in business for yourself, you are not subject to unionization under the National Labor Relations Act. Obviously, if you're a labor union, this is a problem because you want to collect dues and increase the union power in the economy. And if people are in business for themselves, they're not paying union dues, and they're maybe even thinking of themselves as entrepreneurs, thinking of themselves outside of a working class, employing class dichotomy that has always been, even when the labor unions were run by anti-communists, has always been a part of labor union ideology. And of course, what does the Biden administration do? Well, they put out new rules that are going to limit who can be classified as an independent contractor. Result, they hope, would be all those independent contractors become employees, unions get to organize them, more dues and contributions and support for our political allies. However, I think George Mason just came out with a study that when California did this, a lot of those people just flatly lost their jobs.
Yeah, particularly, I know that the side hustles like Uber drivers and things like that. I mean, those people, I travel a lot in my position with Job Creators Network, and sort of the second Hollywood has always been Atlanta, Georgia. And I spend a lot of time up there because our founder is from there. And so, I mean, it was very common for me to have an Uber driver get me from the airport who happened to be also filming some movie. And this was what their side hustle was, because they're an extra or they have a small part or, whatever. But I can't imagine that they'd be in favor of being unionized.
Yeah, no, it's, there are a lot of people who work as freelancers or as contractors who are trying to push back against this. I wish them luck, but the way that the incentive structure is set up within the Biden administration and the Democratic Party, this is something the labor unions really want, and so it's something that the labor department is going to be inclined to give them.
What can employees do, or what legislation or policy reaction can help protect employees from this union abuse?
Well, there are a couple things. There are right to work states. And in a right to work state, if you are in a unionized workplace, you cannot be forced to pay dues as a condition of employment. As far as sort of federal legislation, more to protect workers, there's the Employee Rights Act, which is, obviously it's proposed federal legislation. The current political dynamics are not such that it's likely to become law particularly soon, but it contains several provisions that would protect against some of these moves by regulators, by the National Labor Relations Board, by organized labor itself, to ensure that employees have the individual rights they presently have.
Got it. And we represent small businesses, and small businesses are interesting because it doesn't seem like they are on the receiving end of unionization drives. First question, is that the case, that unions want to just pick off higher employment vehicles? And if that isn't the case, and there are small businesses that are getting approached by unionization drives, what would you recommend they do in response?
Well, part of it depends on what do you mean by small business? Because if you were an owner operator of like a franchised restaurant, let's say, then yes, the unions want to organize you. They want to organize you using this stratagem called joint employer, where the National Labor Relations Board or the Department of Labor deems the brand whose name is on the door to be a joint employer with your independent owner operator, and then the brand whose name is on the door is going to agree to unionization, basically to protect itself at your expense. So, that's an important sort of side issue in sort of determining who's subject to union organizing. As for, independent small businesses, kind of hard to say. There's the only thing that I can really say, I'm not a lawyer or anything, is there's an old union organizer's proverb. And the union organizer's proverb is the best union organizer is a bad boss. And in many ways, the best defense against union organizing would be your best defense against employee discontent in general, which is to be a good boss.
For sure. We work a lot with the Coalition of Franchise Association, the CFA. John Mata, who's the chairman of it right now, is a big Dunkin' Donuts franchisee. He's probably got 30 stores. They view joint employer as, just a total threat to their entire...
Yeah. The franchise guys see joint employer as existential.
Yeah. Yeah, literally would take away their complete autonomy. It's just such a payback from the Democrats to the unions. That is part of the PRO Act, though, right? Can you talk a little bit about the PRO Act and sort of the bigger issue there?
Yeah, so the PRO Act it's been endorsed by the Biden administration and by most congressional Democrats. It is the union Christmas tree. It would invalidate all right to work laws. It would enact the joint employer rules that I was just talking about. It would enact the independent contractor rules that would get rid of most independent contracting. It would legalize secondary boycotts, which, right now, the way the law is, if your union is going to go on strike, they can go on strike against you for something you did, but they can't go on strike against you to make you hurt somebody else.
Okay.
Secondary boycotts are really hard to explain except by analogy or by illustration. Organized left-wing groups do that aren't labor unions, because there's a specific provision of law that says labor unions can't do this. But other left-wing groups, Media Matters is probably the number one historical example of this. They will go after the advertisers to hurt Fox News.
Right.
And if labor unions get this power, the economic consequences could be substantial. And they could use it not just for economic purposes, they could also use it for these ideological purposes we were discussing earlier.
Interesting. My last question is just on the media coverage versus reality of what's happening right now with the protests. I mean, I read every month about how Starbucks is going to be unionized. Starbucks and Amazon are the biggest ones I've seen, but then there's always the Walmarts. I mean, I don't know whether this is just a function of journalists being left-wing and sympathetic and writing about it, or just really good public relations jobs for the unions. But could you just discuss the latest on-the-ground reality of union organizing, specifically maybe at Starbucks and Amazon?
Yeah, Dominic Pino of National Review had a great piece so every year in January, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out like its survey data on how much of the economy is unionized. And you're right, Jordan, and I think to answer your question, the answer is both. It's both journalists are left wing and the unions are really good at PR. This is the year that we're going to come, this is the year big labor comes back. This is the year big labor comes back. We're going to organize Amazon. We're going to organize Starbucks. And they've gotten a couple of, the way that union organizing works, it's at least in most circumstances, it's shop by shop. So they unionize a Starbucks. They unionize a warehouse, not all of them together. And so, you get one or two, but then maybe you lose one. And then, if you can't get a contract within the allotted period, then the employees can consider decertifying or getting rid of the union. And the way it all sort of balances out over the year is they still lost ground in relative to the overall job creation. It's a PR push. The unions have been doing very coordinated PR campaigns for as long as I've been paying attention to this space. People might remember the Fight for 15. That was organized by a political PR firm, Berlin Rosen, and the SEIU. So, this is kind of what they do. And then obviously, journalists aren't going to ask too many questions because they're ideologically aligned with them. And many of them, frankly, are union members. Right. All the big city newspapers are, pretty much all of them are the News Guild, which is a division of the Communication Workers of America, which is one of the most left-wing unions. Right. So, everybody's got their underlying position.
Lukewarm union summer just doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it?
Yeah.
So what are such a small percentage of the overall workforce is unionized, whether private or public unions? What are the public attitudes towards union, regardless of political party? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of public support to me, anecdotally. Yeah.
If you look at public opinion research, people are really favorable on unions, but yet they're not joining unions. What does that mean? Well, it probably means it's a weakly held opinion. People don't have, it's funny, if you look at when has legislation been passed to curtail union power and to curtail union abuses, since the Second World War, there have been two major pieces of legislation, the Taft-Hartley Act and the Landon-Griffin Act, that have curtailed union abuses. And when did they pass? Well, Taft-Hartley Act passed after the largest strike wave in American history. So a time when even Harry Truman had to threaten to draft railroad strikers because they were going to shut down the economy. So a time when unions were very much in the forefront of the public consciousness. Second time, Landon-Griffin Act, that passes after several years of televised hearings into how deeply the mafia had compromised the Teamsters Union. And I think, no, that was before Jimmy Hoffa went to jail. He would later go to jail, but he didn't go to jail at that point. So again, unions were at the forefront of public consciousness. Right now, unions are not at the forefront of public consciousness, even with things like the auto worker strike and the Hollywood strikes. the average American can go through his or her day without having to worry about being inconvenienced even by other people's labor disputes. So it all sounds very nice. But then when the dues dollars hit the road, they aren't willing to sign up.
Interesting. Well, tell our viewers and listeners how they can learn more about Capital Research Center and how to get involved.
Yeah. We publish all sorts of blog posts, podcasts, and intensive research articles at capitalresearch.org. And then also we have our influencewatch.org website that contains a database on all sorts of organizations, from labor unions to big foundations to political action committees. And we encourage everyone to become informed by going to capitalresearch.org and influencewatch.org.
I'm sure there's no shortage of groups for you to look at, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Thank you all for taking the time to listen and watch us. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network, and new episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon.